The first time I ever stepped off a plane, I was clutching a homemade pie and wearing my neat little cardigan, convinced this was the moment my family would finally make me feel like I belonged. Instead, I stood in the middle of Minneapolis airport, watching everyone else get swept into hugs and laughter, while my phone buzzed with a photo of them smiling around a Thanksgiving table that still had room for one more. The caption said "Full House," and in that instant, I realized it didn't mean me. If you've ever wondered how much someone can give before they finally break, you're about to find out. Stay with me till the very end, and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far the truth really spreads. I'm Margaret Lewis, 68 years old, and until last week, I had never been on a plane. I spent my whole life saving every penny for my children, convincing myself their dreams were more important than mine, that someday they'd notice how much I gave up for them. I forgot somewhere along the way that I had a life of my own, and when I finally got on a plane, for the very first time, they left me standing at the airport all alone. The overhead lights of Minneapolis airport buzzed faintly as I stood in the arrivals hall, with my cardigan buttoned neatly over my blouse, holding a homemade pumpkin pie in both hands like it was a fragile treasure. Around me, people rushed by, children squealing as they ran into waiting arms, husbands lifting wives off their feet, grandparents pulled into warm hugs everyone claimed and wanted. I stood among them like a misplaced package nobody had ordered. I shifted my pie from one hand to the other and glanced at the big arrival board just to make sure I hadn't gotten the gate wrong, though I already knew I hadn't. The flight had landed 40 minutes ago, and I'd already walked past baggage claim twice, looking for a familiar face. My suitcase stood at my feet like a silent witness, its little plastic tag swinging back and forth with every gust from the automatic doors. I told myself maybe traffic was bad, or maybe they had trouble finding parking, and I kept watching the glass doors, heart leaping each time someone who looked vaguely like Greg stepped through. But they never did. The families around me kept leaving one by one until the crowd thinned, and I found myself standing there with only a few strangers left, none of them smiling at me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I fumbled for it with one hand, still balancing the pie carefully. The screen glowed with a notification from Facebook. A little thrill of hope fluttered in me as I swiped it open, thinking maybe Greg had sent me a message to tell me where they were parked. Instead, a photo filled the screen. The whole family was sitting at Greg's big oak dining table, all of them smiling wide with glasses of wine raised high. Even little Emma had her arms around Maline's neck, beaming at the camera. The caption below the photo said simply "Full House." I froze right there in the middle of the terminal. My breath caught in my chest, and my hands started to shake so badly I almost dropped the pie. I stared at the photo for what felt like forever, reading the caption again and again, as though I'd misunderstood, as though it might say something else if I just looked hard enough. But it didn't. Full house. They were all there. Every single one of them. Except me. The voices and laughter around me faded until it was just white noise. My cheeks burned and my stomach twisted so tight it hurt. I glanced up from my phone and looked at the doors again, but now I saw clearly that nobody was coming. Not for me. Not tonight. I lowered my phone and let my eyes drift back to the photo one more time before turning it face down in my hand. My fingers gripped the crust of the pie until it cracked slightly under the plastic wrap. I'd baked it the night before, thinking they'd be so happy to see me, thinking it wouldn't feel like Thanksgiving without their mother there to make dessert. It turns out I was wrong about that. I took one slow breath, then another, as people walked past me without so much as a glance. One of the airport workers swept up a candy wrapper from the floor and gave me a polite nod before moving on. And there I stood, just another face in the crowd, invisible to the only people I thought would ever care. I thought about texting Greg, but I already knew what he'd say. He'd say, "Sorry, something came up. We thought you were busy, maybe next time." And I knew I'd just nod along, pretending it was fine, pretending I didn't see the picture of them all smiling without me. The pie felt heavier now, like it was made of stone instead of pumpkin and sugar. My hands ached from holding it so long, but I didn't put it down. I didn't even move. I just stood there, watching the doors, waiting for someone who wasn't coming, wondering how it was possible to feel so cold in a building full of people, wondering what you're supposed to do when you finally realize nobody's coming for you anymore. I can still remember the first winter after my husband walked out. The snow kept piling up outside, and my hands stayed raw from shoveling the driveway alone, but I didn't let myself cry. Greg was only 12 at the time, and already tall enough to see me as more than just his mom. I told myself I couldn't afford to fall apart because he needed me to keep things steady. From then on, it was just the two of us, and every choice I made was for him. I gave up my sewing class so I could work a few extra hours at the grocery store. When my old winter coat started to fray around the cuffs, I stitched it back together and told myself it still looked fine. When the neighbor ladies invited me to go with them to Duluth for the weekend, I politely said no and tucked the money back into the envelope marked tuition. By the time Greg finished high school, I had learned how to live on as little as possible. I cut coupons every Sunday. I drove my car until the muffler dragged on the ground and then kept driving it anyway. Every penny I managed to save went right into his college fund. When he called me from his dorm room one night to say he needed another $200 for books, I skipped lunch for 2 weeks so I could wire it to him without hesitation. The years passed like that one quiet sacrifice after another. I didn't mind. It made me proud to see him wear his cap and gown, even if I had to sit way in the back of the auditorium. I clapped until my hands stung when he walked across that stage. Then came the wedding. Malene was lovely the first time I met her. She wore a silk scarf and a nervous smile, and I thought maybe she'd grow to love me like her own mother. I helped them plan every detail of their big day, even though they didn't ask me to. I baked the favors myself and sewed table runners in the evenings after work. When they couldn't quite afford the photographer they wanted, I emptied my little savings jar to make up the difference. I didn't buy myself a new dress for the wedding. Instead, I wore the same navy blue one I'd had since Greg's graduation. Nobody noticed, which was fine. Nobody asked if I had eaten that morning or if my feet hurt in those old heels. I just smiled for the pictures and stood quietly off to the side. Later, when Malene's mother fell ill, I was the one who wrote the checks for her medical bills. They said they'd pay me back, but they never did, and I never asked. It felt like the right thing to do to show I cared, to help them keep their heads above water. I never took a vacation in all those years, not even once. My coworkers used to joke that I must be afraid to leave town. The truth was, I never even thought about it. I had never stepped foot outside of Minnesota, never boarded a plane, never wondered what it might feel like to stand somewhere far away and look back at my little life from a distance. I told myself it didn't matter, that other people needed those things more than I did. I was too busy to dream, too tired to imagine. I never bought myself new clothes, even when the hem on my church skirt started to come loose. I'd just fold it under and iron it flat. When my friends treated themselves to manicures or nights at the theater, I stayed home and baked bread. Greg always loved the smell of fresh bread in the kitchen. That kitchen was the heart of everything for me. It's where I spent my best hours, kneading dough with my sleeves rolled up, saving the softest rolls for him, making sure his favorite jam was always on the table. I can still picture him sitting there as a boy, swinging his legs under the chair, telling me he was going to take care of me when he grew up. I believed him, so I kept going. I kept saving. I kept giving. Even after he married Malene, even after they bought that big house in the suburbs and started having babies of their own, I told myself my job wasn't finished. I still showed up every Sunday with a casserole. I still mailed birthday cards with crisp bills tucked inside. When Christmas came, I'd spend all of December knitting scarves for the kids and wrapping up little surprises so nobody would feel left out. It never crossed my mind that I could want anything for myself. that I was allowed to. When I heard his voice on the phone this year, sweet as sugar, saying it wouldn't feel right without me, my heart soared like a fool. He didn't know, and maybe I didn't either, how much I'd been waiting to hear him say those words. I thought of all those nights I went without so he could have more. All the quiet mornings I stood at the window, watching my neighbors drive off to somewhere warmer, somewhere brighter, while I stayed behind. I thought about all the dreams I'd tucked away and folded into smaller and smaller boxes until they didn't even feel like dreams anymore. And I said yes. I said yes like it was the easiest thing in the world, because for me it was. Because no matter how many years passed, no matter how much of myself I gave up, I still believed that one day he'd mean it when he said he wanted me there. That one day he'd see me the way I saw him. That one day he'd come through for me just once. And so I bought the ticket. I baked the pie. I packed my suitcase and smoothed down my cardigan and told myself this was my turn at last. I really believed it. The first time they forgot my birthday, I told myself it was just because they were busy. I sat at my kitchen table alone that night, staring at the cake I'd baked for myself, and listened to the silence of a phone that never rang. By the second year, when all I got was a group text that said, "Happy birthday" with a string of balloons and hearts, I saved the message anyway and pretended it was enough. Christmases became just as quiet. They stopped inviting me over for the morning unwrapping, saying the kids were too wound up and it was too hectic. They promised to stop by later, but sometimes they didn't, and when they did, it was only for a few minutes before they rushed back out the door. I still knitted the stockings and wrapped little boxes of candy and slipped cash inside the cards, but I could feel myself fading into the background like part of the wallpaper. Even when I was there, I wasn't really there. Malene's eyes told me so every time she glanced at me from across the table. She'd sigh when I asked the kids about school like my questions were annoying. She'd roll her eyes when I offered to help with dishes, her smile tight and forced, as if my presence was something she simply tolerated for Greg's sake. I started noticing how she always found a reason to sit between me and the children, how she never quite looked at me when she spoke, how her voice would drop when she said my name, like she was reminding herself to include me in the conversation. But Greg was still my boy. He'd pat my hand at the table and tell me how much he appreciated everything I'd done for him. He'd call every so often to ask how I was, and sometimes that was enough to keep me going. Even if his calls were shorter now. Even if they always ended with something else he needed to run off and do. 3 days before Thanksgiving, the phone rang just as I was pulling a loaf of bread from the oven. When I saw Greg's name on the screen, my heart skipped the way it always did when he called. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered, and there he was, his voice warm and familiar as he said it wouldn't feel right without me at Thanksgiving this year. He said the table wouldn't be complete without my pie. He said the kids had been asking about me. I closed my eyes while he spoke and let his words wash over me like sunlight. When we hung up, I stood in my little kitchen for a long time, just staring at the counter. Then I reached for my recipe card and started making a list of ingredients. I decided I'd make 2 pies this year, just in case. That night, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I typed Minneapolis to Denver into the search bar and stared at the options. The prices made my stomach twist, but I told myself this was worth it. This was my family. I could skip a few grocery trips next month to make up for it. I chose a seat near the front of the plane and even paid extra for a little more legroom. I wanted to feel comfortable. I wanted to look like I belonged there when they came to meet me. The next day, I dug out my suitcase from the hall closet and set it on the bed. I folded my best cardigan and blouse, the ones I wore to church on Easter. I wrapped the gifts for the kids in gold paper and packed them carefully in between layers of sweaters so they wouldn't get crushed. I took out my grandmother's pie plate, the one I'd saved all these years, and polished it until it shone. I thought about how Emma would clap when she saw it on the table, how Josh would sneak a finger through the whipped cream when no one was looking. I told myself over and over that this year would be different. This year, I thought they really wanted me there. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, and Margaret gripped the armrests as her heart thudded wildly in her chest. The cabin lights glowed above her warm and yellow, and she whispered to herself finally, as though saying it aloud would make it more real. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unbuckled her seatbelt and reached for her pie still perfectly wrapped and nestled in her lap. The passengers around her bustled with practiced ease, pulling down their bags and stepping into the aisle without hesitation. She stayed seated for a moment longer, soaking it all in, the feeling of having done something new, something brave. When she finally stood and rolled her little suitcase behind her, she kept her head high, proud that she had made it all this way by herself. The walk through the terminal felt like a dream. People streamed past in every direction, laughter and voices echoing through the wide space, families waving at one another as they reunited. Margaret clutched her pie carefully and kept her eyes on the big glass doors ahead. She pictured Greg standing there, maybe even holding a little sign for her like the others she saw, and the thought made her smile. Her shoes clicked softly against the floor as she reached the arrivals hall, scanning the crowd. Her breath caught when she saw a tall man in a dark jacket, and for a split second she thought it was him. But the man swept a woman into his arms, and they walked away together, leaving her standing there. She moved closer to the doors, her suitcase trailing behind her, and waited. She checked her watch. 15 minutes passed, then 30, and still no sign of Greg. Families around her cheered and hugged and carried each other's bags while she stayed rooted to the same spot, her smile fading little by little. Margaret shifted the pie to her other hand as her fingers began to ache. She told herself there must be traffic. Maybe they were circling the parking garage. Maybe Malene insisted on stopping for gas. She kept telling herself that because the alternative felt too sharp, too impossible to let in just yet. The crowd thinned as more and more passengers were claimed. The laughter around her softened to murmurs and footsteps until it was just her and a few strangers leaning on their carts, waiting for someone who never seemed to come. She glanced down at her pie, then back at the doors, and felt her throat tighten. The seconds stretched long and heavy, and for the first time all evening, her excitement dulled into something colder, something heavier than she was ready to name. The little screen above the doors flashed flight numbers she didn't recognize. People she didn't know rushed past without looking at her at all. Margaret set her suitcase upright by her feet and took another breath, shallow and shaky, and waited just a little longer. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a faint vibration that cut through the silence she had wrapped around herself. Margaret jumped slightly, fumbling with the pie as she reached for it, hope lighting in her chest like a stubborn little flame. She thought maybe it was Greg texting to say they were just outside to hang tight, that they couldn't wait to see her. She unlocked the screen and saw the notification waiting at the top. It was from Facebook. She tapped it without thinking, the movement automatic, still believing it might be some kind of explanation, some sign they hadn't forgotten her. The screen lit up, and there it was. The photo filled the display so fast she almost didn't recognize it. Greg's dining room table set beautifully with linen and crystal, the turkey glistening in the center, candles burning low. Around it sat every single one of them. Greg at the head of the table, smiling like he didn't have a care in the world. Malene leaning into him with her perfect hair and perfect smile. The kids giggling, their plates already full. And beneath the photo, the caption read simply, "Full house." Her breath caught in her throat before she even understood why. Margaret stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over it, as though she could somehow swipe away what she was seeing. She blinked, but the image stayed sharp and bright and merciless. Her family was all there. Everyone except her. The noise of the terminal faded to a low hum in her ears. She couldn't feel her fingers around the phone anymore. She couldn't feel much of anything except the sudden rush of heat in her cheeks and the hollow pit forming in her chest. Her eyes stayed fixed on the word full, as though it had been chosen just to cut her down. She stood perfectly still in the middle of the airport, the pie tilting slightly in her other hand. People moved around her, their voices carrying in little bursts of laughter, but nobody noticed her. Nobody looked her way. She was invisible, even here. Margaret lowered the phone slowly and pressed it against her cardigan. She couldn't bring herself to put it away yet. She just stood there, staring through the glass doors, trying not to let the tears reach the corners of her eyes. She had believed him. She had believed every word. And now she stood alone, surrounded by strangers, while her family laughed without her just a few miles away. Margaret set the pie down gently on top of her suitcase and wrapped her scarf tighter before stepping through the airport doors. The cold air bit at her cheeks as she walked outside the blast of wind, making her eyes water, until she couldn't tell if it was from the weather or something else. She kept moving her suitcase wheels, clicking against the sidewalk, as she drifted farther from the glow of the terminal. She didn't have a plan, just a quiet need to get away from the doors and the people and the smell of coffee that clung to her clothes. The parking lot stretched out in front of her, rows of cars shimmering under the yellow lights. She followed the sidewalk toward the edge, her breath coming out in short white puffs. By the time she crossed the street, her fingers had gone numb around the handle of her suitcase. She passed a bus stop but didn't stop. She passed a gas station with bright signs flashing in the window but kept walking. There was something calming about the rhythm of her own footsteps and the way nobody paid her any mind. A few blocks later, she spotted a neon sign flickering in the dark. Tina's Diner, it read, with a smaller sign below that promised hot tea and homemade pie. The windows glowed soft and golden from the inside, and Margaret felt her feet carrying her there before she even made up her mind. She pushed through the door and was met with the quiet murmur of two men at the counter and the smell of something warm and sweet. She chose a small booth near the back and slipped into the seat, setting her scarf aside. The waitress came, and she ordered a slice of cherry pie and a pot of tea in a voice barely louder than a whisper. When the plate arrived, she stared at the bright red filling the crust crumbling at the edges. She ate a bite, then another, though she could hardly taste it. Around her, the diner felt still and safe, the clink of silverware and hum of the heater filling the silence she carried. She wrapped her hands around the teacup and let the heat sink into her skin. Her eyes wandered to the window, watching the cars passing by, the snow starting to fall in light flakes. She asked herself the question she had been avoiding since she left the terminal. What now? The words sat heavy in her chest, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she already knew the answer. And that thought, quiet as it was, held her there just a little longer. The motel room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the heater and the occasional creak of pipes in the walls. Margaret lay on top of the stiff blanket, staring at the ceiling, her hands folded on her stomach, as if she were trying to keep herself still. The pie sat untouched on the little table by the window, its plastic wrap fogged from the chill in the air. She turned over, then back again, the weight of everything pressing down, until she couldn't bear to close her eyes anymore. The clock on the nightstand glowed past midnight, each minute stretching longer than the last. With a heavy sigh, she pushed herself up and reached for her notebook at the bottom of her bag. She flipped it open to a blank page and sat there for a moment holding the pen. Then slowly, she wrote the words as they came to her. They left me. The letters looked sharp in the dim light, as though saying it on paper made it more true. Her pen hovered for a moment, and then she added the next line without really thinking. But maybe it's time I stop waiting for them. Margaret stared at what she'd written, her chest rising and falling with quiet surprise. She set the pen down and rubbed at the corner of her eye, feeling something shift in her that she couldn't quite name yet. She glanced at the little laptop on the desk and almost on instinct opened it. The screen lit up, and she typed into the search bar slowly, her fingers pausing over each word. Around the world tours. Rows of results popped up, bright photos of mountains and oceans and tiny villages she had never even heard of. She scrolled through them, her heart beating faster than she expected. For the first time that night, a faint smile tugged at her lips. Maybe now I can. The thought startled her at first, but the longer she looked at the screen, the more it felt like the beginning of something she hadn't allowed herself to imagine before. She leaned back in the chair, her eyes reflecting the light of faraway places, and let the idea settle like a small spark waiting to catch. The house felt different when she walked back through the door, as if it already knew she wouldn't be staying much longer. Margaret set her suitcase by the stairs and stood in the entryway for a moment, letting her eyes drift over the familiar lines of the place she had called home her whole life. The quiet seemed deeper now, heavier, but there was something steady about it too, something that gave her the courage to move. She started in the living room, pulling down picture frames and wrapping them carefully in old newspaper. The wedding photo of Greg and Malene went into a box with the rest of the family portraits, each one tucked between towels so the glass wouldn't crack. The shelves emptied little by little, and with each empty space she felt something in her chest unclench. In the bedroom, she opened drawers and packed away sweaters, folded linens, and a stack of letters she hadn't read in years. The smell of lavender from the closet filled the air as she worked soft and faint. She found the little keepsakes she had forgotten about, small tokens from long ago, and placed them all in a single box marked Memories. By the time the real estate agent arrived, the house was quiet but neat, her boxes stacked by the door like quiet witnesses. Margaret answered the door with her hands still dusted in packing tape and smiled as she showed him through each room. She listened carefully as he explained the process, his voice calm and professional, and when he asked if she was sure, she nodded without hesitation. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with the paperwork spread out before her. The pen felt cool and smooth in her hand as she signed her name at the bottom of each page. She didn't pause to second-guess herself. She only stopped once to glance at the window, where the fading light caught the edges of the trees she had planted decades ago. The phone buzzed on the table, lighting up over and over with Greg's name. She let it ring and then silenced it, watching the screen go dark again and again. Finally, she typed a short reply and sent it before she could change her mind. "Don't worry, I'm fine." She turned the phone face down and went back to her boxes. Her steps a little lighter now, her breath a little easier. Something about the way the empty walls echoed made her feel almost new, as if the house itself was quietly wishing her well. Margaret stood at the bank counter with a pen in her hand, her signature already scrawled across most of the forms. The last page waited in front of her, crisp and final, and she took a quiet breath before signing her name one more time. When she handed the papers back, the agent smiled and told her the house was officially sold. She walked out into the bright afternoon feeling lighter than she had in years. The air smelled sharp and cool, and she couldn't help but smile to herself as she clutched the receipt in her coat pocket. There was a strange sort of joy in knowing she no longer owed that house anything. That evening, she sat at her little desk, her laptop humming softly as she scrolled through websites full of beaches, mountains, and glittering cities. Each photo made her chest swell with something she almost didn't recognize at first. It took her a moment to name it. Excitement. She found a 6-month tour that promised 10 countries in every corner of the world. Paris, Cairo, Venice. Rio, places she had only ever read about. Her hand hovered over the button, and then she pressed it before she could think too much. She printed the confirmation and placed it on top of her notebook, where she had once written, "They left me." This time, she smiled as she read the itinerary, her finger tracing the names of places that felt like promises. The next morning, she went downtown to buy a new suitcase. She chose one in a soft gray, sturdy but light, and stood in the store for a long time, running her fingers over the handle. In another aisle, she spotted a rack of dresses and almost walked past before stopping. A red dress hung near the end of the row, simple, but striking, the fabric catching the light in a way that made her pause. She pulled it from the rack and held it up, and for the first time in years, she didn't talk herself out of it. She bought the dress without even waiting for it to go on sale. At the post office, she filled out her passport application, her writing firm, and steady as she handed it over. The clerk smiled and wished her safe travels, and she felt herself standing a little taller as she left. That night, she laid the dress across her bed next to the new suitcase and her itinerary. The color gleamed against the quiet white of her sheets, bold and sure of itself. Margaret sat on the edge of the mattress, looking at everything she had gathered, and felt something bloom inside her. She had waited her whole life for someone else to give her permission to feel alive, and now, finally, she had given it to herself. The hum of the plane engines faded into the background as Margaret pressed her forehead lightly to the window and watched the clouds drift below. The morning light spread in soft gold across the horizon, and she felt a quiet thrill rise in her chest. She whispered to herself that she had really done it as the captain announced they were approaching Paris. The first morning there, she sat outside a little bakery in Montmartre, a flaky croissant on her plate and powdered sugar dusting her fingertips. She laughed aloud after her first bite, the buttery layers melting on her tongue, and the man at the next table smiled at her delight. The streets around her were full of color and chatter artists painting on the corners and children running past with bright scarves trailing behind them. She wandered through narrow alleys and wide boulevards, letting herself get a little lost among the cafes and bookshops. The Eiffel Tower glimmered at dusk, and she stood beneath it, craning her neck, feeling very small and very alive all at once. Later that evening, she wrote a postcard to Emma, telling her how the lights sparkled like stars and how she couldn't wait to tell her everything she'd seen. Venice came next, and she could hardly believe how quiet the water felt as she stepped into a gondola for the first time. The boat rocked gently as the gondolier pushed them through winding canals lined with crumbling stone walls and flower boxes. She dipped her fingers into the cool water, grinning at her own reflection as the bells of a distant church rang out over the rooftops. At the market, she bought herself a bright silk scarf and draped it around her shoulders, catching her breath at her own boldness when she caught sight of herself in a shop window. She sat by the Grand Canal that night, sipping a tiny cup of espresso and watching the city glow gold in the fading sun. The scarf slipped slightly down her arm, but she left it there feeling every bit as beautiful as the scene around her. Cairo came later, and the heat pressed down on her shoulders as she stood at the edge of the desert. The pyramids rose ahead of her, ancient and quiet and impossible. Her guide offered to take her picture, and she stood there for a long time after he handed the camera back, just staring up at them. She ran her palm over the warm stone of one of the great blocks and closed her eyes, trying to imagine the hands that built it thousands of years ago. There was something almost holy in the air, and she whispered thank you to no one in particular as the wind lifted a little dust into the sky. Then came Brazil, and she didn't even try to hold back her laughter as the music of the festival filled the streets. Her red dress clung to her shoulders as she twirled among the dancers, letting the rhythm carry her along. The drums pounded in her chest, and the scent of roasted meat and sweet fruit clung to the air as confetti floated down around her like rain. She let a young man with a wide smile lead her through the crowd, spinning her in time to the beat. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt light. Lighter than air. That night, she sat on her hotel balcony barefoot, writing a postcard to Emma under the soft glow of a street lamp below. Her hand paused halfway down the card before she wrote the words that had been growing inside her since the moment she boarded the plane. "I'm finally living." She slipped the card into its envelope and set it on the table beside her, a quiet smile playing on her lips as she watched the stars over Rio. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was waiting anymore. She felt as though she had just begun. Margaret was sitting in a quiet cafe in Florence when her phone began to buzz on the table beside her. She glanced at the screen and saw Greg's name flashing, the sound of it almost strange after so many weeks of silence. She let it ring for a moment before picking it up and holding it to her ear, her other hand still wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. There was a pause before his voice came through shaky and low, asking where she was, and saying he'd just heard from the bank about the house. He stumbled through his words, saying he hadn't realized she was serious, that he and Malene didn't mean to hurt her the way they had. He asked her to come home so they could talk. Margaret looked out the window at the cobblestone street, at the way the light fell over the old stones and the people moving through the square with baskets of bread and flowers. She let him finish before answering, her voice calm and steady, as she told him she already was home. Wherever I am. On the other end of the line, she could hear him inhale sharply, as though her words had taken something out of him. He started to say something else, but she didn't wait, only wished him well and told him to take care of the kids. Then she ended the call and set the phone face down on the table. She let herself sit there for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the cafe, feeling nothing but a quiet sense of peace settle over her. She had spent her whole life waiting for them to see her. Now she finally saw herself. The coffee cooled in her hands as she watched a little girl outside chasing pigeons through the square, her laughter bright and full. Margaret smiled softly to herself, realizing for the first time she didn't feel like she had left anything behind. She felt like she had finally stepped into her own life. Margaret sat in the thin mountain air, the sun already softening into afternoon light behind her. She held the camera steady in front of her and smiled faintly, her cheeks pink from the climb. When she began to speak, her voice was warm and even, carrying just enough strength to feel like it was meant for anyone who needed to hear it. If you've spent your whole life waiting for someone else to make you feel alive, stop. She let the words settle, her eyes shining as she looked straight into the lens. You are your own home. She drew in a long breath and glanced over her shoulder at the peaks stretching into the distance, the ancient stones of Machu Picchu glowing gold in the sunlight. You are your own adventure. Her lips curved upward, then a smile that came from someplace deeper than happiness, something like peace. She lowered the camera for a moment and closed her eyes, feeling the wind whip through her hair. It carried the scent of grass and stone and freedom, a smell she would never forget. When she raised the camera again, her tone softened, but held a quiet defiance, the kind that comes when a person truly understands their worth. I am not spare. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the camera as she said it. I'm not a side dish at someone else's table. Her voice barely trembled now. And I'm not waiting anymore. She stood, then her feet planted firmly on the worn stones of the peak, and let her arms stretch wide into the mountain air. The wind caught her sleeves and the edges of her scarf, carrying them out behind her like a banner. Her eyes closed again as the sun touched her face, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She felt whole, and she smiled, knowing she would never forget the way this moment felt, or the woman she had finally become.